2 years ago, I had a rare day off and figured I'd treat myself to a bit of shopping at a large mall near my home. It was the weekend, so I wasn't surprised to find the place buzzing with people. The mall was a familiar spot for me. I'd been there more times than I could count, so navigating through the crowded walkways felt second nature. I spent hours wandering through stores, picking up a few things here and there, and enjoying the relaxed pace of the day. By the time I decided to wrap things up, it was late in the afternoon, around 4 or 5 p.m. The mall had started to calm down, with fewer people milling about, but it was still far from empty. I gathered my bags and began making my way back to the parking garage. My car was on the 4th level, tucked in a corner spot where I'd left it earlier. As I stepped into the cooler, dimly lit garage, I noticed the shift in atmosphere. The vibrant energy of the mall was replaced by the quiet echo of my footsteps, the stillness pressing in from all sides. But at that moment, I was just focused on getting home, blissfully unaware of the unease that would soon settle in. My pace slowed as I neared my car, something off about the scene in front of me. It took a moment for my brain to process what I was seeing. There were photographs taped all over my car. Some were stuck to the windshield, others clung to the side windows. In total, there were about 10 pictures, fluttering slightly in the cool garage air. At first, I was just confused, wondering who would pull such a bizarre prank. But as I moved closer, the confusion twisted into something much darker. The photos were of me. Each one captured a different moment from that day. I saw myself in various stores, browsing through clothes, examining items, and even standing in line to pay. Some pictures were taken from a distance, almost like a casual snapshot, but others were disturbingly close. One in particular made my skin crawl. It showed me walking, with the photographer just a few feet behind, close enough to reach out and touch me. My blood ran cold as I realized that someone had been following me all day, snapping these pictures without my knowledge. Fear surged through me. I quickly ripped the photos off my car, stuffing them into my bag, while my eyes darted around the parking garage. The space, once just an ordinary part of the mall, now felt like a maze of potential hiding spots. Every shadow, every parked car, seemed to conceal a lurking figure. My heart hammered in my chest and my hands trembled as I fumbled with my keys. I needed to get out of there, away from this unsettling scene. Once inside my car, I locked the doors immediately, the sharp click of the locks offering a small sense of security. But as I sat there, breathing heavily, I couldn't resist the urge to look at the photos again. My mind raced, trying to recall any strange encounters from earlier in the day, but nothing stood out. The mall had been so crowded that it would have been easy for someone to blend in, to watch me without raising suspicion. The realization that I had been completely unaware of this stalker filled me with dread. I didn't know who they were, what they wanted, or if they were still watching me at that very moment. The only thing I knew for certain was that I needed to get out of there fast. With shaky hands, I started the car and sped out of the parking garage, the oppressive silence of the space giving way to the roar of the engine as I drove into the fading daylight. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as I descended the levels of the parking garage, my nerves already frayed from the discovery of those photos. When a car pulled out behind me, I barely noticed it at first, but as I continued down the winding exit ramps, the car remained just a little too close for comfort. It was a dark SUV, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just another shopper, heading home. But the pit in my stomach told a different story. By the time I merged onto the highway, the SUV was still there, hugging my bumper like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I switched lanes a few times, hoping they'd pass, but they didn't. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. They were following me. I fought against the rising tide of panic, trying to think rationally. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe they were heading in the same direction. But when I took the exit towards my city, the SUV did too, and that's when the panic fully set in. I was only minutes from home, but there was no way I could lead this person there. What if they knew where I lived? What if they'd been watching me longer than I realized? I couldn't risk it. With trembling hands, I pulled up the nearest police station on my phone's map and made a snap decision to head there instead, praying I'd lose the SUV on the way. My eyes flicked constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, where the SUV loomed like a dark omen, refusing to back off. I took turns more quickly than I should have, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew the station was close, but the SUV stayed right behind me, relentless. Finally, just a street away from the police station, the SUV veered off, turning abruptly down another road and vanishing into the night. I didn't dare follow. Didn't dare slow down until I pulled into the station's parking lot. My hands were shaking as I parked the car, barely able to keep my grip on the photos as I hurried inside. The officer at the front desk listened patiently as I explained everything, my words tumbling out in a rush. I handed over the photos, describing the SUV as best I could, but I knew it wasn't much. Without a license plate or a clear description of the driver, there wasn't much they could do. They took my report, reassured me they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they weren't hopeful. For days, I was on edge, jumping at every unfamiliar sound, every shadow that seemed too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. But nothing happened. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the fear began to fade. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could after something like that. I even forced myself to go back to the mall a few weeks later, just to prove that I could. Thankfully, nothing happened. No more photos, no SUV tailing me, just an ordinary trip to the mall. But the unease never fully left me. To this day, I have no idea who was behind it or why they did it. Maybe it was some sick prank or maybe something more sinister. I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, I never want to experience anything like that again. A few months back, my wife and I were getting ready for a wedding. It was one of those events you knew would be a big deal, so I wanted to make sure I looked sharp. My wife suggested I get fitted for a suit at a tailor her family had trusted for years. She swore by the place, so I figured, why not? After a long, exhausting day at work, I decided to knock out the fitting on my way home. It was already late, around 8 p.m., and the darkness had settled in by the time I pulled up to the address my wife had given me. To my surprise, I found myself parked in front of an old, rundown mall. The kind of place that might have been lively back in the 90s, but had since fallen into disrepair. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few scattered cars sitting under flickering streetlights. For a moment, I wondered if I had the wrong place. I pulled out my phone to double-check the address, and sure enough, the map pointed me right inside the mall. The building loomed before me, its entrance dimly lit, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off. If this was the spot, then I'd just get it over with and head home. The moment I stepped inside the mall, a wave of unease washed over me. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses down on you, making every footstep echo like a distant thunderclap. The few overhead lights that still worked cast a sickly yellow glow on the cracked tiles below. Most of the storefronts were dark, their once bright signs faded or missing altogether, leaving only ghostly outlines where letters used to be. The place felt like a tomb, long forgotten by the world outside. I wandered the hallways, my footsteps the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Store after store stood abandoned, their insides gutted and empty. Dust clung to the remnants of mannequins and display cases, relics of a time when the mall had been full of life. But now, it was as if I was the only person who had stepped foot in here in years. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. As I walked further into the mall, one store caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar, which was strange given that the store appeared to be closed. Through the narrow opening, I saw a man inside. He was dressed in jeans, in a hooded sweatshirt, his face hidden in the shadows as he moved around. For a moment, I thought he might be a worker, clearing out the last of the store's inventory. But something about the way he moved was off, hurried, almost frantic. Then, as if sensing my presence, the man froze. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. Even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt his eyes lock onto mine, a cold, unsettling gaze that sent a chill down my spine. Without warning, he spun around and vanished deeper into the store, out of sight. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking. I wasn't here for whatever that was. I just needed to find the tailor and get this over with. After what felt like an eternity of wandering through the dark, twisting hallways, I finally spotted a sign at the end of a corridor. The word tailor glowed faintly above a door that looked as out of place as I felt. I pushed through the door and stepped inside, relieved to find the shop open and lit, a small oasis of normalcy in the otherwise dead mall. The tailor greeted me with a polite nod, and I spent the next 15 minutes getting measured, trying to shake the image of the man in the hoodie from my mind. But even as I stood there, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't wait to leave, to get out of that mall and back to the safety of my car. After getting measured and leaving the tailor shop, I felt a sense of relief, ready to leave the unsettling atmosphere of the mall behind. But as I retraced my steps through the dimly lit hallways, the unease from earlier crept back in. The eerie silence seemed to press in on me from all sides, amplifying every sound, every creak of the old building. As I passed the same store with the propped open door, my heart sank. The man was still there, but this time, he wasn't just passing by. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His hood was pulled low over his face, obscuring his features, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to get out of there as fast as possible. So I did. I walked past him, forcing myself to stay calm, though every muscle in my body tensed with the urge to run. I was almost at the exit when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the store door opening behind me. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, but growing louder, quicker. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't dare look back, but the sound of those footsteps closing in on me was impossible to ignore. Just as I reached the glass doors leading to the parking lot, the footsteps broke into a run. Panic took over. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the man charging toward me, his face still hidden in shadow, but his intent clear. He flung the doors open with such force that they slammed against the walls. Without a second thought, I bolted for my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my keys. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my ears, getting closer and closer. By some miracle, I managed to unlock my car just as I reached it. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, my hands shaking as I locked the doors. The man reached my car a second later, his face twisted with rage. He pounded on the window, the glass shuddering under his fists. For a terrifying moment, I thought the window might break. But then, with a final desperate slam of his hand against the glass, I started the engine and floored it. As I sped out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the middle of the lot, watching me disappear into the night. My mind raced as I called the police, reporting the incident in a shaky voice, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Later, when I had to return to the mall to pick up my suit, I made sure to go during the day. The place didn't seem nearly as ominous in the sunlight, but the memory of that night still haunted me. Even now, I can't explain why that man came after me or what he wanted. The whole experience remains one of the scariest moments of my life. And while I still tease my wife about how her tailor almost got me robbed in an abandoned mall, there's a part of me that can't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't made it to my car in time. I work at a small perfume store tucked away in a massive mall, one of those sprawling labyrinths with hundreds of shops. The store I work at is tiny, just big enough to hold the shelves lined with bottles of every scent imaginable. It's so small that only one person is needed to run it at a time, and most days, that person is me. Usually my shifts are quiet, The occasional customer wanders in, testing out perfumes or asking about skin products, but for the most part, I spend the hours in solitude, watching people pass by through the large glass windows that frame the entrance. The store closes at 8 p.m., and by then, the mall is almost empty, the crowd's long gone, leaving behind a kind of eerie stillness. That day, everything seemed normal. Customers trickled in here and there, sampling scents and making small talk, but it was mostly uneventful. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant chatter from the mall's hallways provided a comforting background noise, but as the clock ticked closer to 5 or 6 p.m., the usual rhythm of the day began to shift. Something felt off, like a subtle change in the air, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. It was just a sense, creeping in slowly, that tonight would not be like the others. As I sat behind the counter, the familiar view of the mall's hallway stretched out before me, framed by the large windows on either side of the entrance. It was the same scene I'd watched countless times, shoppers strolling by, sometimes pausing to glance at the displays, but rarely stopping to come inside. I'd grown used to the ebb and flow of it all, so when the man appeared, he stood out immediately. He was wearing a mask, something between a clown and a grotesque caricature. It wasn't the kind of mask you'd expect to see outside of Halloween, and certainly not in the middle of summer. He walked past the store slowly, almost deliberately, and as he did, his head turned sharply in my direction. Then, without warning, he stopped, pressed his face against the glass, and stared directly at me. At first, I tried to play it off. People did weird things in the mall all the time, and I assumed he was just some prankster looking for a reaction. I even managed a nervous laugh, thinking he'd soon get bored and move on. But he didn't. He stayed there, his masked face inches from the glass, eyes boring into me. The longer he stood there, the more the laughter died in my throat. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the air thick with a tension that made my skin crawl. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he stepped back. But instead of walking away like a normal person would, he paused, his head tilting slightly as if he were considering something. Then, with one last unnerving glance in my direction, he turned and walked away. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was nothing, just some idiot trying to be funny. I forced myself to focus on the customers who came in afterward, smiling and helping them with their purchases. But I couldn't quite rid myself of the image of that mask. It lingered at the edges of my thoughts, making my heart race every time the door chimed or someone passed by the windows. Then, around 7 p.m., just as the mall was starting to wind down and the foot traffic had thinned out, I saw him again. This time, he didn't stop in front of the store. He walked past it, but as he did, his masked face turned towards me, his eyes locked onto mine as he moved by. There was something different this time, though, something darker. I could feel a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The once comforting background noise of the mall was fading, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The few remaining customers were wrapping up their shopping, and the mall was starting to empty out. The man didn't come back after that second encounter, but his presence clung to the air like a shadow. Every time I glanced at the windows, I half expected to see him there, staring in at me again. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake, and as the minutes ticked down towards closing time, the sense of unease grew into full-blown fear. As the clock struck 8 p.m., I exhaled a sigh of relief. The day was finally over. I walked to the entrance, closed the glass doors, and locked them with a satisfying click. The mall was nearly empty now, the once bustling corridors reduced to hollow echoes. All I had to do was finish up a few closing tasks, and I could leave this strange day behind. But as I turned back toward the counter, I froze. There he was again, the masked man. He stood directly in front of the doors, staring at me through the glass with those same unsettling eyes. My breath caught in my throat as he reached for the door handles, tugging at them in vain. The doors didn't budge, of course, but the sight of him trying to get in sent a chill down my spine. I watched as he stepped back, seemingly unfazed by the locked doors. For a brief moment, I hoped he'd just walk away, maybe realizing the mall was closed and it was time to leave. But instead, he began pacing back and forth in front of the store, his eyes never leaving me. There was an intensity in his gaze. Something that made it clear he wasn't just some prankster looking for laughs. He was waiting for me to come out. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence of the store. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as I remained behind the counter, too scared to move. I considered calling for help, but before I could, a mall security guard came into view. Relief washed over me as the guard approached the man, exchanging a few words with him. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the interaction was brief. The masked man hesitated for a moment, then slowly began to walk away, the guard following close behind. I waited a few more minutes, my eyes glued to the entrance, making sure he didn't return. When I was finally certain he was gone, I grabbed my things and hurried out of the store, locking the door behind me. The mall was eerily silent now, the emptiness amplifying my every footstep as I made my way through the deserted corridors. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. When I finally reached the parking lot, the cool night air hit me like a splash of cold water. I quickened my pace, eager to get to my car and drive far away from this nightmare. But as I reached my car, my heart dropped. There he was again, standing about 100 feet away near another set of entrance doors. His masked face was tilted slightly, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. He didn't seem to notice me this time. But I didn't wait to find out. I fumbled with my keys, unlocked the car, and jumped inside, slamming the doors shut behind me. I locked the doors immediately, my hands trembling as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back one last time. He was still standing there, motionless, staring into the distance as if he was waiting for something or someone. I made it home safely that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. The image of that masked man haunted me, his eyes boring into my mind long after I'd left him behind. Even now, I can't help but wonder what he wanted, what his plans were, and what might have happened if I'd left the store just a minute earlier.